They were cheap, lurid, and dangerous. Cinema's forbidden children that played in smoke-filled grindhouses and vanished before the mainstream dared to notice. But what if the most shocking films of the 1960s weren't blockbusters, but exploitation flicks too raw for polite society? These weren't just movies. They were cultural earthquakes. Some were banned, others buried. All left scars. Are you ready to unlock them? Number 12. Blood Feast, 1963. At first glance, Blood Feast looked like another low-budget horror flick, until audiences realized they were watching something unlike anything before. Directed by Herschel Gordon Lewis, it advertised itself as the first splatter film. And it lived up to the claim. The plot? A demented caterer harvesting human body parts for an Egyptian feast. Critics called it garbage. Newspapers dubbed it revolting. And yet lines formed around drive-in theaters. Why? Because people had never seen gore on this level. Tongues ripped out, limbs dismembered. It was grindhouse mythology being born. City councils across America panicked. Some counties outright banned it, while religious groups picketed theaters, demanding arrests. Behind the scenes, the production was as chaotic as the script. Buckets of animal organs from local slaughterhouses were bought for a few dollars, leaving sets reeking in the summer heat. Crew members nearly gagged during shooting. But Lewis had tapped into a strange alchemy. Outrage equals ticket sales. The backlash was ferocious, but so was the profit. Made for less than $30,000, it earned millions in grindhouse circuits. Critics mocked it as the death of cinema. Audiences whispered about it for decades. Today it's preserved as a cult classic, the seed from which modern gore cinema sprouted. It wasn't polished, and it wasn't respectable, but Blood Feast showed that fear, disgust, and curiosity could be monetized, and that realization forever changed the darker corners of cinema. Number 11. Mondo Cane, 1962. When Mondo Cane premiered in Europe, it promised a daring documentary-style look at strange customs from around the world. But what audiences got was something entirely different. This Italian film invented the shockumentary, a kaleidoscope of rituals, cruelty, and voyeurism stitched together in a way meant to stun, not inform. Its premise was simple. Travel the globe and capture the most bizarre, disturbing practices of mankind. From animal cruelty to morbid funeral rituals, everything was framed as exotic. Some scenes were genuine, but many were staged for maximum shock. Still, audiences didn't know that in the 1960s. They left theaters whispering about barbarism abroad, when much of it was cinematic manipulation. Governments were horrified. Critics condemned it as racist, exploitative, and sensational. In Britain, censors slashed minutes from the real. In America, newspapers debated if it was documentary truth or depraved fiction. But here's the twist. Despite the outrage, Mondo Cane earned an Academy Award nomination for Best Original Song, proof of how tangled its legacy became. Behind the camera, directors Gualtiero Jacopetti and Franco Prosperi reveled in their controversy. They coined the term Mondo film, spawning an entire exploitation subgenre that would escalate into even darker territory. Films like Africa Addio and Goodbye Uncle Tom. The legacy of Mondo Cane is unsettling. It blurred reality and fiction, exploiting global suffering for profit, yet shaping decades of shock cinema. Even today it lingers as a warning. Once curiosity becomes exploitation, truth is the first casualty. Number 10. Olga's House of Shame, 1964. When Olga's House of Shame appeared in grindhouse circuits, even hardened audiences whispered about its extremity. The film was marketed as a daring crime tale, but revealed itself as one of the earliest entries in the roughy exploitation cycle. Set in a murky underworld, it followed a sadistic crime matriarch, Olga, as she ran a criminal empire built on blackmail, drugs, and cruelty. Unlike traditional Hollywood crime dramas, this was stripped of glamour. The world was sweaty, oppressive, and unrelenting. Its depiction of corruption and domination was meant to shock, not entertain. Theater managers warned it might go too far, and in many cities, authorities agreed. Police raids shut down screenings. Some states refused distribution entirely, branding it obscene. Behind the scenes, the Olga films were churned out quickly and cheaply. Producer Joseph P. Mara and distributor George Weiss knew exactly what they were doing. courting controversy as a business model. Each title in the Olga series escalated in intensity, deliberately daring censors to react. Cast members were often non-professionals, paid little, and thrown into dangerous or humiliating situations that blurred the line between acting and reality. Critics scoffed at its lack of artistry. Mainstream audiences dismissed it as gutter entertainment. But the Grindhouse faithful treated it as forbidden fruit, a glimpse into something darker than the studio system dared offer. And over time, the film achieved notoriety as a landmark in exploitation history. Olga's House of Shame didn't just shock viewers. It proved audiences would pay for transgression itself. And in doing so, it paved the way for countless exploitation cycles that blurred morality and commerce. Number 9. The Defilers, 1965. Released through the legendary Something Weird video vault, The Defilers became infamous for being one of the starkest exploitation films of the decade. It presented itself as a grim morality tale, but what audiences encountered was raw and unsettling. The plot followed two wealthy young men who, drunk on privilege and power, spiraled into acts of cruelty. The marketing framed it as a cautionary story about youth gone wild, but the images on screen were far more disturbing. The claustrophobic black and white cinematography intensified the sense of entrapment. Instead of offering escape, it forced audiences into a confrontation with human depravity. Even in a decade that celebrated rebellion, this film struck nerves too raw. Local censors reacted swiftly. Some theaters yanked it after a single showing, fearing outrage. In conservative towns, police seized prints and arrested projectionists. Religious leaders labeled it a plague on morality. Yet, in underground circles, the film's notoriety grew. It became whispered legend, passed around on bootleg reels. Behind the curtain, its creators insisted they were crafting social critique, an exaggerated warning about unchecked decadence. But the line between moral message and exploitation was blurry. Few critics bought the excuse. Instead, they saw it as exploitation using shock as a sales tactic. Today, The Defilers is preserved not as high art, but as a chilling reminder of the decade's obsession with pushing limits. It's a film that reveals more about the anxieties of the 1960s than the story it told, and its shadow lingers in every gritty indie thriller that came after. Number 8. She-Devils on Wheels, 1968. Imagine the counterculture era colliding with biker gangs, all filtered through exploitation cinema. That was She-Devils on Wheels. Directed by Herschel Gordon Lewis, the same man who gave the world Blood Feast, this film dared to flip gender norms in the most chaotic way possible. It followed a ferocious all-female motorcycle gang known as the Man-Eaters, as they roared across towns, challenging every idea of what women in cinema could be. On the surface, it played like another biker exploitation flick, but beneath the roaring engines was something radical. These women weren't passive sidekicks or background ornaments. They were in charge, violent and unashamed. For many, it was both thrilling and terrifying. Critics called it a feminist nightmare, while youth audiences celebrated its rebellion. Authorities weren't sure how to handle it. Some communities banned it outright, labeling it obscene. Others treated it as dangerous, fearing it would inspire real-life biker gangs. In truth, it was cheaply made, filmed in Florida with local bikers, giving it a raw authenticity that mainstream cinema couldn't replicate. Behind the scenes, Lewis leaned into the chaos. Actors performed their own stunts, often dangerously. Budgets were shoestring, yet the energy was electric. The result was a film that defied traditional narratives while still living squarely in exploitation's shadow. Though dismissed in its time, She-Devils on Wheels has been reappraised as an unlikely cult feminist artifact. What once seemed scandalous now reads like a bizarre act of liberation. It remains a loud, unapologetic reminder that exploitation films could sometimes stumble into subversive territory. Number 7. Scum of the Earth, 1963. It called itself The First Roughie, and it lived up to the claim. Scum of the Earth wasn't a horror film or a crime epic, it was something grittier. Shot in black and white by Herschel Gordon Lewis, the master of grindhouse shock, it exposed the underworld of modeling scams that preyed on young women. The story followed a naive girl lured into a photo studio with promises of glamour, only to be trapped in a cycle of manipulation and coercion. Unlike glossy Hollywood melodramas, there was no rescue, no hero, and no gloss, just a relentless descent into exploitation. Audiences left stunned, unsure whether they had just seen fiction or something dangerously close to reality. Police in several states targeted theaters screening the film. Its unflinching tone earned it the label of indecent, leading to seizures of reels and raids on drive-ins. Critics condemned it as trash, yet teenagers and young adults whispered about it, sneaking into midnight screenings. For some, it was terrifying. For others, it was irresistible. Behind the scenes, Lewis and his producer David F. Friedman knew exactly what they were doing, inventing a new category of cinema. They coined the term roughie to describe films that were darker and meaner than earlier exploitation, and the formula caught on. Dozens of imitators followed, each trying to push boundaries further. Over time, Scum of the Earth developed a cult reputation. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't slick, but it tapped into cultural paranoia about corruption, sleaze, and the dangers lurking just beneath suburban respectability. Its legacy lies in how it rewired exploitation cinema into something far more sinister. Number 6. The Sadist, 1963. Some films are remembered because they terrified audiences more than big-budget thrillers ever could. The Sadist, starring Arch Hall Jr., was one of those films. Released with little fanfare, it quickly became infamous among grindhouse crowds for its unrelenting intensity. The story was simple, yet horrifying. 3 teachers on a road trip find themselves stranded, only to encounter a deranged killer modeled after real-life murderer Charles Starkweather. Armed with a pistol and a sneer, Hall's character terrorizes them with sadistic glee, turning the desert into a killing ground. Unlike polished Hollywood thrillers, this film was raw, sweaty, and shot in blistering heat. Cinematographer Vilmos Zsigmond, who would later become an Oscar-winning legend, captured every drop of sweat and every tremor of fear with handheld urgency. That realism unsettled audiences more than special effects ever could. Censors reacted harshly. In some regions, theaters refused to screen it at all, fearing community backlash. Critics dismissed it as tasteless and brutal. Yet, among film students and cinephiles, it began circulating as a secret masterclass in tension. Word spread that beneath the grindhouse surface was artistry. Behind the scenes, the shoot was brutal. Cast and crew endured desert sun, long hours, and real danger from cheap equipment. But the end result was unforgettable. Though ignored by mainstream critics of its day, The Sadist has since been hailed as one of the most effective low-budget thrillers ever made. Its legacy is clear. Sometimes exploitation films reveal raw genius, hiding beneath the grime. And in The Sadist, terror wasn't spectacle. It was a claustrophobic mirror of human cruelty. Number 5. A Taste of Blood, 1967. At a time when Hammer horror dominated Gothic terror, Herschel Gordon Lewis tried something audacious. A 2-hour vampire epic marketed as the first American Dracula film. A Taste of Blood wasn't a polished studio picture. It was exploitation horror dressed in Gothic ambition. The story followed a businessman who inherits a strange estate, drinks a mysterious potion, and transforms into a bloodthirsty killer. It was meant to rival European vampire films, yet it leaned heavily into Lewis's signature gore. The result? A strange hybrid of Gothic tradition and grindhouse excess. Audiences were bewildered. Critics scoffed at its clunky pacing, but recoiled at the graphic scenes of bloodletting. Drive-ins played it with lurid taglines promising terror beyond imagination. But here's the twist. Many theaters cut its runtime, removing chunks of dialogue and story, leaving only the violent highlights. This made it feel even more unhinged. Behind the scenes, Lewis faced pushback from distributors who feared no one would sit through a 2-hour exploitation film. Cast members worked for low wages, and the production dragged on, adding to its chaotic atmosphere. Yet Lewis pressed forward, convinced it would cement his reputation beyond Blood Feast. Though it never reached mainstream acceptance, A Taste of Blood has since been reappraised as one of Lewis's most ambitious projects. Today, cult film historians see it as a fascinating bridge between Gothic horror and the grindhouse splatter tradition. Its legacy reminds us that exploitation films weren't always cheap thrills. They sometimes aimed for the grandeur of epics, even if ambition outpaced execution. And in that messy ambition, history found something unforgettable. Number 4. The Wild Angels, 1966. Before Easy Rider captured the counterculture, there was The Wild Angels. Directed by Roger Corman and starring Peter Fonda, Nancy Sinatra, and Bruce Dern, this biker exploitation flick rolled into theaters with revving engines and sneers that terrified polite society. The story followed a ruthless motorcycle gang, loosely inspired by the Hells Angels, who lived outside the law. The film didn't sugarcoat their chaos. Brawls, funerals turned into riots, and an atmosphere of rebellion draped in leather and gasoline. It wasn't a morality play. It was pure provocation. Authorities across America were appalled. In some towns, screenings drew protests. Churches warned parents to keep teenagers away. In Britain, the censors demanded cuts before release, slashing entire sequences. Critics accused it of glorifying lawlessness, even though the film ended on a note of futility and despair. But here's the twist. Controversy sold tickets. Behind the scenes, Roger Corman shot the film fast and cheap, as always, using real bikers as extras. Fonda and Dern immersed themselves in biker culture, giving the film a raw credibility. The production itself was chaotic. Fistfights broke out between actors and real bikers, and the police had to intervene more than once. When it premiered, audiences were electrified. Youth culture saw it as a symbol of freedom. The establishment saw it as a threat. Either way, it launched an entire cycle of biker films that would flood grindhouses through the late 1960s. Today, The Wild Angels is remembered not just as exploitation, but as the film that set the stage for counterculture cinema. It shocked the world by daring to embrace chaos as the point. Number 3. Faster, Pussycat. Kill, Kill, 1965. Russ Meyer's most notorious film wasn't about subtlety. Faster, Pussycat. Kill, Kill exploded onto the screen with fast cars, desert landscapes, and women unlike anything cinema had dared show before. Voluptuous, violent, and unstoppable, the film's 3 anti-heroines carved a path of destruction across the California desert. When it was released, critics dismissed it as gutter trash. "Degenerate!" one headline sneered, but audiences in midnight screenings whispered about it for years afterward. These women weren't victims. They were predators. They outdrove, outfought, and outschemed every man they encountered. For 1965, that was seismic. The controversy was immediate. Censors demanded cuts in Europe. In the US, theaters refused to screen it, fearing backlash. Religious groups railed against its perversion of morality. But Meyer didn't care. He leaned into the chaos, branding himself as the king of lurid cinema. Behind the scenes, the production was just as intense. Actors clashed with Meyer, who drove them through grueling desert shoots under blistering sun. Stunt work was dangerous, often improvised on the spot. Yet the final result pulsed with energy. Every frame a collision of aggression and style. The film was largely forgotten after its initial run. But in the 1980s and 90s, feminist critics and cult audiences rediscovered it. What once seemed like trash was reinterpreted as subversive art. Quentin Tarantino even called it one of his biggest influences. Today, Faster, Pussycat, Kill, Kill is hailed as a cult masterpiece, a strange alchemy of exploitation and empowerment. Once condemned, it now stands as a defiant symbol of outsider cinema. Number 2. I Drink Your Blood, 1969. Few exploitation films carried titles as brazen as I Drink Your Blood. Released at the very end of the decade, it became notorious for pushing grindhouse cinema into shocking new territory. The story followed a small town terrorized by a cult of rabid Satan worshippers who, after being secretly fed meat tainted with rabies, descend into madness and violence. The premise alone was outrageous, but on screen, the hysteria, gore, and paranoia reached fever pitch. Censors were horrified. The Motion Picture Association refused approval, forcing distributors to release it unrated. Local boards demanded massive edits. Some theaters promoted it with sensational gimmicks, warning signs, barf bags, and adults-only banners. In conservative regions, it was outright banned. Behind the scenes, the production was a scramble. Shot on a shoestring budget in upstate New York, it used local actors and guerrilla filmmaking tactics. Director David E. Durston encouraged improvisation, heightening the chaotic feel. Cast members endured grueling conditions, with little safety oversight. Critics tore it apart, calling it vile and incoherent. But audiences, especially youth audiences, were captivated. Its shocking imagery made it one of the first films to receive an X rating purely for violence. Word spread quickly, and bootleg prints circulated for years. Over time, I Drink Your Blood developed cult status. Restorations revealed how transgressive it truly was for its time. Today it's remembered as a milestone in grindhouse excess, the film that broke boundaries wide open as the 60s gave way to the darker 70s. Its legacy is clear. Exploitation cinema wasn't just cheap thrills. It was an unfiltered howl of chaos, daring the world to look away. Number 1. Cannibal Holocaust of the 60s. Africa Addio, 1966. If there was one exploitation film of the 60s that truly shocked the world, it was Africa Addio, directed by Gualtiero Jacopetti and Franco Prosperi, the same team behind Mondokane. This so-called documentary tore into global consciousness with images that left audiences shaken, governments outraged, and censors scrambling. Promoted as a daring expose of post-colonial Africa, it claimed to reveal the continent as it really was during the upheavals of independence. On screen, however, what viewers encountered was something far darker. Graphic executions, chaotic wars, and animal slaughter, filmed with an unflinching lens. Some sequences were authentic, others were alleged to be staged. Either way, the effect was the same, shock that bordered on trauma. The controversy was instant and global. In Britain, it was banned outright for decades. In the United States, it faced heavy censorship, with reels cut to ribbons by local boards. Across Africa, governments condemned it as racist propaganda, a brutal distortion of their struggles for independence. Rumors swirled that Jacopetti and Prosperi had actually incited violence to capture their footage, an allegation they denied but never fully escaped. Behind the scenes, the production was as dangerous as the images suggest. Crews shot in war zones, often under fire. Local authorities tried to shut them down. In one infamous episode, Jacopetti was arrested in Congo on suspicion of murder, accused of orchestrating an execution for the camera. Though acquitted, the scandal cemented the film's poisonous reputation. Critics called it exploitative and dehumanizing, but audiences, especially in underground cinemas, couldn't look away. Some whispered that Africa Addio was the most dangerous film ever made. Over time, its legacy morphed into legend, influencing everything from later Mondo films to notorious works like Cannibal Holocaust in the 70s. Today, it remains one of the most controversial exploitation films in history. Not a celebration of truth, but a chilling example of how cinema can manipulate horror, politics, and prejudice to make a profit. And it still asks the haunting question: when does documenting reality become exploiting it? These were not polished studio epics. They were jagged, raw, and often banned, cinema's forbidden experiments that shocked an entire generation. Some vanished, others became cult classics, but all remind us how far filmmakers would go to provoke. Which of these films shocked you most? Like, subscribe, and comment below, because the next reel may be even darker.